The mosque was quiet, its golden lights glowing softly against the deep blue sky. Worshippers gathered inside, ready to break their fast, their voices hushed with devotion. And then a man stepped in tall, unassuming, dressed simply in a hoodie and jeans. At first, no one noticed him. But as he removed his hood and took a quiet seat in the back, whispers rippled through the crowd. It was Keanu Reeves. No cameras, no entourage, just one man, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. What happened next would leave everyone in that mosque and later the entire world in tears. But to truly understand the significance of this night, we need to go back to where it all began. The city was alive, yet something about this evening felt different. Keanu had spent weeks immersed in long film shoots, early call times, hours of meticulous scenes, late-night rewrites. It was the kind of exhausting routine he had learned to embrace. Yet tonight, his mind wasn't on the cameras, the lines, or the flashing lights. Tonight, something else called to him. As he stepped out of the studio, stretching his stiff shoulders, he heard it. The call to prayer. It wasn't just a distant sound. It was something deeper, something that vibrated in the very air, carrying through the city like a whispered invitation. The melodic voice rang out, weaving between the buildings, soft yet commanding. It wasn't noise. It was purpose. It was devotion. Keanu froze mid-step. He had heard the adhan before in his travels, in documentaries, in stories from friends who had described the beauty of it. But hearing it now, in the stillness of the evening, it felt different. It felt personal. He glanced around. The streets were filled with people hurrying about their business, some heading home, some rushing to restaurants, some walking with family. But a certain group moved with intention. Men, women, and children, dressed in their finest yet modest clothing, heading in one direction. Their steps weren't rushed, yet they carried a purpose, as if answering a silent invitation. Keanu found himself drawn to them. He had always been fascinated by different cultures, by people who found strength in their beliefs. He wasn't religious, but he respected faith in all its forms. The quiet strength it gave people, the way it shaped their lives, their kindness, their discipline. And Ramadan? He had read about it. A month of fasting, reflection, and generosity, a test of patience and gratitude, where food and water were set aside from dawn until dusk, not out of deprivation, but out of devotion. And now he wanted to understand, not by watching a documentary, not by reading about it online, but by experiencing it. No cameras, no interviews, just a man, walking alone, searching for understanding. He followed the sound weaving through the streets, his footsteps quiet against the pavement. After a few minutes, he found himself standing before a modest mosque. It wasn't grand. There were no towering gold and domes or elaborate marble courtyards, no flashing lights announcing its presence. Just a simple, humble structure welcoming those who sought peace within its walls. Outside, families gathered, their voices warm as they greeted one another. A small boy ran up to his father, clutching his hand excitedly. A group of elderly men stood together, their conversation soft, their faces illuminated with quiet reverence. There was something deeply moving about it. Keanu hesitated at the entrance. Would he be welcome here? Would they see him as an outsider? Would they question his presence, his intentions? The thought of having a third child in our family is overwhelming. Would they understand? Understand that he came with respect. Understand that he wasn't here to interrupt, to take pictures, to make a spectacle. He was here to listen, to learn. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. Stepping inside the mosque, Keanu Reeves felt something shift. The air was different here, not just in temperature, but in energy. There was peace. A quiet reverence filled the space. Wrapping around him like an unseen force. Something sacred, something unspoken. He stood for a moment, taking it all in. The scent of warm bread and fresh dates lingered in the background. The aroma of spiced rice and slow-cooked meats hinted at the meal that was soon to tune. But for now, the food sat untouched, waiting for the call that would signal the end of the fast. No one was eating yet, despite the hunger that surely gnawed at their stomachs after a full day of fasting. No one even reached for a sip of water. Keanu had heard about this kind of discipline before the patience. The self-restraint, the unwavering devotion to something greater than oneself. But seeing it firsthand, it was something else entirely. He moved carefully, keeping to the back of the room, finding a quiet space where he wouldn't disturb anyone. His world Hollywood, the flashing cameras, the endless scrutiny of every step he took felt so far away. Here, no one rushed up to him. No one asked for a selfie. No one whispered behind his back. Instead, they let him be. For the first time in a long time, Keanu wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't John Wick, or Neo, or any of the characters the world knew him for. He was just a man among men. And for a moment, he allowed himself to simply exist. He watched as families gathered, their voices hushed yet warm, exchanging soft smiles as they prepared to break their fast together. He watched as an elderly man sat beside a stranger and offered him a cup of water because in this place, no one was alone. He watched as a young girl helped her mother arrange plates of food, her small hands moving carefully, as if she knew even at her age that this was an act of love. Everything had meaning here. Every gesture, every glance, every shared moment. And for Keanu, that meant everything. Then, something unexpected happened. From the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. A young boy no older than 10 was walking toward him, his small hands carefully carrying something. A date, and a small cup of water. Keanu blinked, momentarily caught off guard. The boy stopped in front of him, his dark eyes filled with something pure, something simple. He held out the offering, his voice soft yet certain. Here. Keanu looked at him, his heart swelling with something indescribable. This child didn't care who he was. He wasn't giving this to Keanu Reeves, the movie star. He was giving it to a guest, a fellow human being. For a second, Keanu couldn't speak. He took the date gently, holding it in his hand as if it were something delicate, something fragile. It was just a date, just a cup of water. And yet, it was so much more than that. It was an invitation, a gesture of acceptance, a silent way of saying you are welcome here. Keanu swallowed the lump in his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. The boy just smiled, then turned and ran back to his family, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. But to Keanu, it was anything but. He stared at the date in his palm for a moment, feeling its weight, not just the physical object, but the meaning behind it. And then, as the call to break the fast echoed through the mosque, he lifted the date to his lips and joined them. Keanu had seen wealth in its most extravagant forms. He had dined in the world's finest restaurants, attended exclusive galas where crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, where tables were adorned with gold-trimmed plates and meals were crafted by Michelin star chefs. But this was something else entirely. As he sat among the worshippers, he watched in quiet amazement. There was no extravagance, no gourmet delicacies, no luxurious presentation. Just simple food, warm bread, steaming rice, tender meat, dates, and cool water shared among friends, family, and strangers alike. Yet, it felt like the richest feast he had ever witnessed, because here the act of eating wasn't just about nourishment. It was about something far greater. It was about community, humility, gratitude, and Keanu couldn't ignore the way it moved him. He sat for a long moment, absorbing everything. The way people passed food to one another before serving themselves. The way no one was left out, no one was forgotten. Then he got up. Without a word, without hesitation. Keanu moved toward a group of volunteers who were distributing meals. They hadn't noticed him yet. They were busy, focused, efficient. Some ladled steaming portions of food onto plates, while others moved swiftly between guests, making sure everyone had what they needed. And then, before he could second-guess himself, Keanu did something unexpected. He rolled up his sleeves. He reached for a tray, and he began to serve. For a few minutes, no one realized who he was. He was just another set of hands, moving carefully, making sure plates were full, cups were filled, and every guest was taken care of. He worked silently, his movements calm and unhurried. One plate, then another, and another. He handed a bowl of rice to an elderly man who smiled at him warmly. He poured water into the cup of a young mother, who nodded in quiet thanks before handing it to her son. Keanu had played many roles in his life. Tonight, he played the role of a servant, and it felt more meaningful than any scene he had ever performed. But then, someone stopped mid-bite. Their eyes widened as they looked at him. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Is that Keanu Reeves?" Someone else turned to look, then another. And before long, whispers spread across the room like wildfire. Yet, even as recognition dawned on the faces around him, Keanu remained exactly the same. He didn't pause. He didn't look up to acknowledge the whispers. He just kept serving. People were stunned. Not because a celebrity had shown up, not because a Hollywood star was in their midst, but because he wasn't acting like one. He wasn't there for attention. He wasn't making a spectacle of himself. He wasn't doing this for cameras, for a headline, for applause. He was simply helping. And with every small act of kindness, the atmosphere in the room shifted. At first, there had been surprise. But now there was respect. Because Keanu Reeves, a man who had everything, had chosen to spend this night serving others. And in doing so, he had given them something money could never buy: genuine humility. The meal had ended, but the night was far from over. The once lively hum of conversation had softened, replaced by a quiet stillness. The scent of food still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of burning incense. Some men stood to pray, their movements slow and deliberate, a rhythmic display of devotion. Others sat together in small circles, their voices hushed, sharing stories, reflections, and words of gratitude. Keanu sat among them, his hands resting lightly on his knees. He wasn't speaking, nor was he in a rush to leave. There was something about this moment, something sacred, something grounding. He let himself take it all in. The atmosphere was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Beside him, an elderly man sat with his hands clasped together, his gaze distant yet peaceful. There was wisdom in his posture, a quiet strength that came from years of faith and experience. After a moment, the man turned to Keanu, his voice gentle but filled with certainty. "You are not Muslim." Keanu met his gaze and nodded. "No," he admitted, "but I wanted to understand, to be here." The old man studied him carefully, his lined face unreadable at first. Then, after what felt like a long moment, he smiled, a small but knowing smile, one of acceptance rather than curiosity. "That is enough," the man said simply. Keanu held on to those words. He didn't need to explain himself further. He didn't need to justify why he had walked into this mosque, why he had spent the evening serving food, sharing in a meal, and listening in silence. He wasn't here to prove anything. He was here to learn. They sat together without speaking. Two men from completely different worlds, one a Hollywood star, accustomed to bright lights and global fame. The other, an old man whose world revolved around faith, prayer, and quiet acts of kindness. And yet, in this moment, none of that mattered. No cameras, no scripts, no expectations. Just two human beings, side by side, connected by something deeper than words. Keanu's eyes drifted to the front of the mosque, where rows of worshippers were now lined up, preparing for their evening prayers. He watched as they bowed in unison, their foreheads touching the ground, their movements synchronized in a way that felt both personal and collective. It was a display of humility unlike anything he had ever seen. These people, men, women, children, had fasted all day, resisting food and water, pushing through hunger and exhaustion. And yet, their first instinct after breaking their fast was not indulgence. It was not excess. It was prayer, gratitude, surrender to something greater than themselves. Keanu felt something stir inside him. Not a revelation, not a sudden understanding of faith, but a deep, quiet respect, a recognition of something sacred, something profound. He had spent his life in an industry that glorified power, fame, and material success. Yet here, in the simple act of bowing, of whispering words of thanks into the silence, he saw something far greater: peace. And in that moment, he knew this was a night he would never forget. A night had settled into a peaceful hush, the energy in the mosque still lingering with warmth from shared meals and whispered prayers. Keanu felt it in his chest, a sense of calm, a kind of stillness that was rare in his world. He had come here with no expectations, no agenda, just curiosity, respect, and an open heart, and in return, he had been given something far greater than he had imagined. As he prepared to leave, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple, unmarked envelope. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to draw attention. It was just a gesture, small way to give back to a community that had welcomed him with open arms. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on one of the mosque's elders. The man, dressed in traditional white garments, exuded a quiet dignity. His presence commanded respect, but his eyes held nothing but kindness. Keanu stepped forward and gently pressed the envelope into the elder's hands. "This is for the mosque," he said, his voice steady but sincere, "for whatever you need." The elder blinked, looking down at the envelope before glancing back at Keanu. For a moment, he seemed unsure of what to say. "This is too much," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Keanu simply smiled, shaking his head. Not at all. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't linger for acknowledgement. He just gave without expectation, without hesitation. And with that, he turned and stepped out into the night, the cool air greeting him as he left the mosque behind. The elder stood there for a moment, watching him go before looking down at the envelope in his hands. Something about Keanu's presence had been different, humble, genuine, and touched by the ego that so often followed those with fame. Slowly, he unfolded the envelope, and his breath caught. Inside was a donation large enough to change lives, enough to help renovate the mosque, repair the aging roof, and expand the prayer space for the growing community, enough to provide hot meals for those in need, to feed families who struggled to put food on the table, enough to fund education programs for children who had never been given the opportunities they deserved. It was a gift that would ripple through generations. By morning, the news had begun to spread. Keanu Reeves, one of the most famous actors in the world, had not only shared a meal with the community, not only joined them in breaking their fast, but had also given without asking for anything in return. No cameras, no interviews, no headlines crafted for the sake of publicity. It was simply an act of kindness. A quiet, powerful moment that proved that true generosity doesn't need an audience. And though Keanu would never seek recognition for what he had done, the world would remember. Because in the end, it wasn't about the money. It wasn't about fame. It was about respect, humanity, the willingness to give not just wealth, but time, effort, and heart. And that was something far greater than any Hollywood role. That night, Keanu Reeves walked into a mosque as a stranger. By the time he left, he had become a brother. He hadn't come for attention. He hadn't come for recognition. He had come with an open heart. And in return, he had been welcomed with open arms. Because in the end, faith is not about who you are or where you come from. It's about kindness, respect, and the willingness to see the beauty in others. And that night, in a quiet mosque under the stars, Keanu Reeves reminded the world of exactly that.